This is Legislatures, the Inside Story, and I am your host, Tim Story. I'm the CEO at the National Conference of State Legislatures, and today on the podcast, we're going to get some perspective on leadership from Thomas Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt, thanks to my guest, Clay Jenkinson. He's a presidential historian who is an editor-at-large for Governing Magazine. He's been a source in several Ken Burns documentaries, most recently Benjamin Franklin on PBS, and also recently released documentary Theodore Roosevelt on the History Channel, which was produced by Doris Kearns Goodwin along with Leonardo DiCaprio. Jenkinson performs as these historical figures, Roosevelt, Meriwether Lewis, and most especially Thomas Jefferson. His recent book is called Repairing Jefferson's America, A Guide to Civility and Enlightened Citizenship. He probably knows Thomas Jefferson more intimately than any human alive.
I have been married to him.
You have been married to him. That is pretty intimately acquainted with Thomas Jefferson.
When I think back on it, I've been involved with Jefferson now for more than 3 decades. And in a certain sense, it's like a marriage. You know, in a marriage, there are great moments and less great moments. There are times when you can't stand to be in the same zip code together, and other times when you just are so enamored. With Jefferson, it's up and down. I've fallen in and out of love with Jefferson over this time. Great new understandings have come forth since I began. I mean, if you look through the lens today, it's a very different Jefferson from the lens, say, of 1980. And so I've kind of grown with Jefferson, and I know, Tim, it sounds like I'm making this a joke, but I've probably spent more time with Thomas Jefferson than with any other human being.
Clay Jenkinson, I'm really glad you could join me today and talk about Jefferson and all of the historic figures that you are intimately acquainted with.
I'm so glad to be here because I have great respect for what you do. I must tell you, last week I was in Philadelphia and I gave an endowed lecture there for the Library Company of Philadelphia, which is the oldest subscription library in the world. And the lecture was on Alexander von Humboldt and Thomas Jefferson. But I got to hold in my hands the journals of Lewis and Clark, to hold in my hands. And then I got to hold a book that they carried all the way from Philadelphia to the Pacific coast and back again. And Lewis presented it back to its owner, Benjamin Smith Barton, with an inscription. And it's in great shape. I don't know how Lewis kept it in such great shape. If I drive 100 miles, the things in my car are breaking down. But it was like one of the most thrilling weeks of my life. And Lewis of Lewis and Clark is one of the characters that I have performed as, and I have traveled the trail many times, and I've written a long book about the character of Meriwether Lewis, and now I got to hold the journals in my hands.
It's safe to say you love history, and this means more to you than just, oh, cool, I saw this in a museum through a glass.
My training was in literature and the classics. I lived in your part of the world briefly. I lived for 4 years in Boulder and taught Latin at the University of Colorado and studied ancient Greek, which every good Jeffersonian should do. I've gotten to perform in 50 states of different characters: Jefferson, Lewis of Lewis and Clark, John Wesley Powell, the Civil War hero and explorer, John Steinbeck, the novelist, and Theodore Roosevelt, of course. It's been a glorious. I get to evade life by pretending I'm someone that I'm not.
Did you, in a million years, 30 years ago, whenever you started trying this hat on, think that this would be your life?
No, and if I had thought about it, I wouldn't have done it.
Huh. Why do you say that?
You know, I've got a whole room of costumes. You know, I used to travel happy, but now after 9/11, you know, I have wigs and tights and buckled shoes and dirks and swords and beards, and I stopped carrying the Quran altogether, I can tell you that.
It's the logistics of being these characters that is the big hassle.
It's all that spirit gum, you know, you have to paste on the beards. There's something inherently stupid about the whole enterprise until you open your mouth. I get up there's a crowd of 300 or 1,000 people, and I pretend to be somebody that's dead, and they pretend to believe it, and we have an actual discourse about serious issues.
Well, I'm going to tell you, I was one of those audience members probably 25 years ago. I can't even remember. I want to say it was at Monticello, but somewhere along the way, I had the good fortune of being one of your audience members. And I have been in thousands of sessions about important issues of our time and leadership and all this, but that stuck with me. I mean, so there's something magic about what you do.
There is a magic to it, not to be too funny about it. There's a magic because, if you said to me, Mr. Jenkinson, I know you're a historian, how shall we evaluate Jefferson on slavery? I would give you an answer, and it would be a smart answer. But if you said to Jefferson, sir, how do you really square this with your principles that all human beings are created equal? This is a whole different enterprise now. Because as a scholar, I'll talk about anything to the best of my understanding. But if I'm asked this as Jefferson, then I have to think, well, A, how would Jefferson respond? Do we know? We do know. B, how do I convey that to the audience in a way that also lets them see the limitations of his answer to that? How am I true to history and to Jefferson and to the current mood of the country, which is very unhappy with Jefferson about this, as is right? And so it's a complicated thing that's going on. It really works. I can remember once this fifth grader said to me, raised her hand at the end of sort of a program, and she said, Mr. Jefferson, now that you've seen our world, what would you like to take back with you to Monticello? Which I thought was an incredible question, because she never would have asked that of a historian, never in a million years. But I empowered her through the thing I was doing to perform herself, and she counter-performed and asked this question, and I said penicillin. But imagine how great that was, that she, as a fifth grader, her mind was buzzing over this.
It's a wonderful way to get people's brains thinking and get, really fire the neurons and get people going. And I'm telling you, man, I remember it. I remember you doing that, doing your bit, and there's something very sticky about it, and which is hard these days in a world of TikToks and endless YouTube videos. So I hope you're still doing this, right? You're still out there.
I do some. The COVID was a little rough on all of that. I didn't travel much during that period. I wrote a bunch of books. I wrote 4 books during those 2 years. I'm totally exhausted now, but I still do some. But I'm increasingly, I'm changing I do this thing called the Thomas Jefferson Hour, which is a podcast and a public broadcasting program, an hour-long weekly thing, and I'm morphing it into something called Listening to America. And here's the point I want to make about that I think that if everyone who listens to this turned on their television and watched half an hour of Fox and then half an hour of MSNBC, they'd have this idea that the country is dying, that there are enemies within, that the issues are as great as they've been since the Civil War, that the republic may simply collapse. But then if you go out to Butte, Montana, or Broken Bow, Nebraska, or Lyon, Colorado, you see real people doing real things. Yeah, they have a politics, but they don't wear it. It doesn't run very deep. They're just authentic, wanting to have good lives, to better the lives of their children. They want to live in a country that is recognizable to them. They want the temperature of our politics to come down. They want real answers to our problems rather than the kind of posturing that we're getting right now. And I don't know how much that percolates into your work with state legislatures, but it certainly characterizes the National Congress of the United States. And so I want to go out and listen. A little bit like Charles Kuralt, but without the schmaltz and without the giant CBS crew, but to go out and listen to America and hear what's on people's minds and try to cheer up about it, because I think we all get a little disillusioned when we watch too much media.
Yeah, I think this resonates terrifically with state legislators, many of whom are hopefully the listeners of this podcast, as well as many of the legislative staff who work in these institutions, because I hear this over and over again. People don't realize that well over 85% of the more than 100,000 bills that legislatures pass in any given calendar year are bipartisan. I mean, there's a terrific amount of work on tons of issues that are not hyper polarized, and people are dug in, and just you have to fear the other side. Of course, our concern is that it is somehow, whatever that percentage is growing of people who can't see that you're not just wearing the red jersey or the blue jersey. So I think this is a big concern. Hey, this gives me a little bit of a pivot to one of the questions I really wanted to ask. We know that Jefferson spent at least 3 years in the Virginia legislature at the time. This was before the constitutions. We're legislatures. This group is. So was that the best time in Jefferson's life? Did he love being in the legislature? Then he was 3 years as governor, so he was 6 years at the state and local level.
His time as governor was the least happy time of his life. Not only his wife died during that time, it was the darkest period of the war. The British invaded Virginia not once but twice, and Bannister Tarleton with his dragoons came right up to Monticello and occupied it. Jefferson was then investigated by the legislature of Virginia for malfeasance. That petered out, and he was later apologized to. But this was not a great time for him. He was not a great governor, and the reason why this is probably maybe an interesting point for you, Tim. He was not a great governor because he was a strict constructionist, and this was after independence, and so we had very weak governors because we had seen what strong governors looked like. And so here's this emergency, and Jefferson is playing it straight according to the descriptions in the Virginia Constitution, when in fact the people wanted a kind of masterful man on horseback, someone who might even be a temporary dictator to get us through the crisis. And Jefferson was, no, I will do my job and I won't expand beyond those boundaries a bit. Well, if you flash forward to Theodore Roosevelt 100 years later, his view was, I'll do anything that the Constitution doesn't explicitly forbid. So Jefferson was a prisoner of his ideology there, and I think he learned from that and became a much better president when he became president than he had been as governor. But back to the legislature, two things. One is that he revised the entire law code of Virginia almost by himself, and he said it was the most difficult work of his life. Moving from a colonial system into a small R republic, he did that, and proposed 128 new laws for Virginia. I mean, it was a work of genius. And secondly, he was able to get passed in 1786 the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, which is one of the most important pieces of legislation in the history of legislatures anywhere on earth. But here's the key to that, Tim. You got to have a Madison. Jefferson was this amazing intellectual dreamer, visionary, reformist, utopian almost. But he didn't have any legislative stamina. And he would introduce the ideal bill and then walk away and do something else at Monticello, working on his garden or inventing something or writing a treatise. That's not, as you know, that's not how legislation passes. There needs to be somebody who's willing to do the painstaking work of seeing it through the process of horse trading, of compromise, of listening, of accommodating people's concerns. And that man was James Madison. So we would not have a Virginia statute for religious liberty if Jefferson had been alone. We wouldn't have it if Madison had been alone. It took the genius of the one and the political capacities of the other to form this partnership.
So what advice do you give to, because I think these men and women come into legislatures all the time who, I want to go fix this problem and, whatever they perceive to be the biggest problem of their state at the time. And yet you can't just have the great idea and expect it to just roll through.
No, you need a Madison, and not everyone gets one. I mean, Madison, I always say Madison was a great man who gave his life to the work of a greater man. That almost never happens. But, I mean, somewhere between Lyndon Johnson leaning into people viscerally and taking them by the shirt and saying, you're going to pass this civil rights bill, I tell you you're going to pass it, and here's why, otherwise you're not going to get your interstate highway or whatever it is. There's that end of the spectrum, which works, but it's a little bit disquieting. But then on the other end, there's someone like Barack Obama, who turned out to be a great visionary, but he didn't have that capacity to go up to the Hill and do the hard, have the lunch, listen to the junk that has to come out of people's mouths, to accommodate, to take joy in it. You have to take joy in it, I think, in order to be effective at it. And you have to make other people realize that you're likable. So here I'll morph to Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt got away with way more than he should have as a president of the United States because people liked him. They admired him. Even people who didn't like him liked him, if that makes any sense. He just had that kind of charisma and pizzazz. He was a war hero. He was our first cowboy president. He was brilliant. He talked a mile a minute, and he was always interesting. And people liked him, and he liked them, and they knew it.
There's a cultural, legislatures have a very distinct culture. they spend a lot of time together, and these sessions get drawn out, and executives by their nature want action. They want it their way. And what I hear you saying is that the path to success, at least from an executive standpoint, I'd like to talk a little about legislative leadership. Being the speaker or the Senate president or chair of a key committee and getting something done. But this notion of how you better lean into that culture, or it's just going to be frustration after frustration.
I'll just say one last word about the presidency. This is a non-political statement, I think. One of the problems that Donald Trump had was that he had been a CEO, and a certain kind of CEO, always got his way through his whole life, and wasn't used to the kind of the glacial pace and the backtracking and the inefficiency of our congressional, of any legislative session. And if you are a CEO that thinks, I want to do X, I want a military parade, for example, that has to be Washington, D.C. planning, and it has to be the military, and it has to be funding. And suddenly you realize, oh, you can't just say you want to get things done and they happen. You have to go work that. And that working that means building coalitions. And it sometimes means building coalitions with people whose ideology is not yours.
Well, it takes a lot of patience too. And a lot of those kinds of leaders are not exactly endowed with patience.
This happens in state legislatures too, but I think that my own view is that, I'm a Jeffersonian, so of the three branches of government, the most important is the legislative branch. I think that's more true in states than it is in the federal system.
The U.S. Constitution, which makes the legislature the first branch, was obviously kind of ripped off from the Virginia Constitution, which also had it as the first branch.
They were all ripping off Montesquieu. Montesquieu, the great French theorist, gave us the formula for separation of powers and checks and balances. And his book, The Spirit of the Laws, was the most influential book of the 18th century, and they were all reading it and taking their cues from it. And it took different forms. Franklin wanted a unicam system. Jefferson wanted bicameral, but they were all listening to their Montesquieu. Today, and here's my one criticism that I'll share, at least, of legislators, is that they don't read enough. They read policy stuff. They read emails. But they don't step back and read Plutarch. The founding fathers were the geniuses that they were because they stepped back and read Tacitus and Plutarch and Bolingbroke and Rousseau and Voltaire and Dr. Johnson and David Hume and Adam Smith. And so they were like, their minds were abuzz. Today, a legislator, and I know a lot of them, they're just so overwhelmed, overstimulated with demands and people wanting their attention. And it's hard for them to get the bandwidth to go reflect. I would like to be able to find a way, and I know what you do is partly this. It's partly this, is to encourage these overworked, overstimulated people. And I mean this. They're hard working. They mean to do the right thing. And they're exhausted by the end of a session. And they're even kind of just like their head's ready to explode. We need to carve out space for them to reflect and to read and to ask questions that they don't get to ask much, like, what is my purpose here? What's the thing I should be doing for the people of South Dakota or the people of Oregon or whatever? And I think that you get so caught up in the rhythm of the thing, even in a state where nothing is at stake, like North Dakota. But think of a state like Texas, where everything is at stake, or Massachusetts or New York. The exhaustion of the legislator is a very serious problem, and that it becomes a spiritual exhaustion too, where they just become, I can't take in anymore. I'm just gonna vote.
Well, my radar tells me from talking to a fair number of legislators just in the last 2 or 3 months that this is the worst the burnout factor has ever been. Now, we always have this, like, it's worse today than it's ever been, and I don't have a study that proves this, but my intuition is fairly strong that somehow there's a breaking point. Some of it's the pandemic and all this kind of coming into play, but this notion that you could step back. By the way, legislature is usually like your third or fourth job in some cases, because you've got a regular job, you own a small business or whatever, you've got a family, you might have some other things going on. You coach Little League Baseball or whatever. But I love this thought. How do we do that? We have puzzled over this at NCSL for years to get people to step back and reflect. One of my constant frustrations is that legislatures as institutions are on a 2-year time horizon. So this thought of like pulling back and taking time to think beyond the 2 year, the next election, and those pressures are much greater. That's the other job they have, is to run campaigns and get reelected and keep the majority. So can you solve that for us? Do you have a way? How do we change the institution?
Well, I don't know that I can solve it because I don't think you're going to go for my plan. But let's just say you brought me 250 legislators from around the country, and they agreed to this, and they handed their cell phones over when they got here. And I drove them out to the Badlands of North Dakota. We went to Roosevelt's Elkhorn Ranch, and you have to hike in about a quarter of a mile. It's a very simple hike. And we got there, and we had chairs and some refreshments, and we sat there and we talked about Roosevelt and the American West and Badlands and national parks and recreation and what makes for a full life. I promise you, when they came out, they would have calmed down some. They would have made friends. They would have learned something worth knowing. There would be a kind of I got to breathe a little bit, and no one was making a demand on me, that this was just a chance to drink in the fresh air and to look at the Little Missouri River and to think about this great man who came out to North Dakota when he was 24 years old, and he was just a shrimp with bad health. He's kind of a 98-pound weakling almost. And he was transformed out in the Badlands of North Dakota to become one of the greatest presidents in our history, in the top 5, certainly. I think if people could see that and experience it, they would think, oh, I know why I'm doing this. I know why I'm doing this.
Well, do you want my job? Because this is exactly what I puzzle over. We have done programs somewhat in this vein at Gettysburg, at Buckman Tavern on Lexington Green, and in Normandy. We actually have taken groups to Normandy, and it's this whole, because again, back to you performing Jefferson, it's sticky to get people to step back, and somehow there's the neurons fire differently when you're in that space, and I think that would serve the Republic.
I think it could happen. I think that if you invited, how many are there? 7,000?
Yeah, 7,000 legislators, yeah, roughly.
If you invited them and said, the first 250 that sign up will get this trip, we'd fill it.
Well, I think we're on to something. We will explore this. Hey, this gives me a great way to talk about something I want to make sure we hit on. This Repairing Jefferson's America, Guide to Civility and Enlightened Leadership. One of the things I hear is that we are as uncivil as we've ever been. Of course, there was that war in 1860, but can you put that in perspective in terms of how bad or not bad is it, and can you solve it for us? Can Jefferson solve it for us?
You're closer to it than I am, but here's my impression that, first of all, it's always been this way. We've had periods of more and periods of less, but don't pretend there was ever this, the senior senator from Virginia yields to the junior, that's protocol, and it very seldom is reality. We've always been a political people. We've always been a kind of a grumpy people, and there's a lot of factionalism. Jefferson got to be president after one of the most prolonged election crises in American history. There were people that said the election was stolen. There were people that called him a Negro president because of the 3/5 clause. Federalists tried to block his installation as president and to bring in Aaron Burr instead. I'm just talking about the one I know. This happens all the time. This myth, this kind of civics text myth, or when, We the People Project myth, where you think, about harmony and civility and good sense and so on. Yes, sometimes, but not always. And so this is a particularly difficult time because I think there's anger. It's not in the legislature so much, it's in the people. And the legislators are like looking over their shoulder like, boy, the people are all stirred up. They want me to say this.
Well, pardon me for a quick interruption, they're reading their Facebook feed and they're reading their Twitter feed.
Yeah, they're reading Facebook and they're watching MSNBC and Fox.
And it's just vile. It's bile coming at them, and it's in an extreme.
So let's say you could guarantee to the legislature of Texas or North Carolina, that they will deliberate for 90 days and they will pay no penalty for voting their best sense in their conscience. That there's no TV, there's nobody watching, they should just do what they think is the right thing to do about whatever. They would do it, most of them.
What form of government is that called?
No, we need transparency, but our transparency now is such that we're driving the right to the right and we're driving the left to the left, and everyone is frightened of being primaried. And, just to take again, and not to be partisan at all, but President Trump is now less important than Trumpism. So that whatever energy he invoked and touched off is out there, and it's strong. And then the left is in a righteous mood about their vision of the country. And so this anger, this kind of wrath and angst and distrust is driven now more by the people than by the legislature itself. And I think that many legislators, if you ask them, would say, if the people would just leave me alone to try to do the right thing, I could really try to do the right thing. Facebook and social media have really changed the equation. And I do believe that some of the elected officials of our time have been throwing kerosene on this thing, and that's a mistake.
So what is the first step on the path out of this? Your guide to civility and enlightened citizenship.
I know this sounds crazy, Tim, but it is actually civility. So Jefferson he wrote this letter to his nephew, and he said, ideally, you're born with civility and with good nature, but most of us aren't. But if you show artificial good humor, and always, no matter how much someone provokes you, if you respond with civility and even a generosity of spirit, he said, two things will happen. Number one, it will slightly shame the other person because you're showing them what it should look like, and they might actually change a little. Secondly, he said, it's second nature to you, but it's second nature. It becomes your habit of dealing with the world, and I've tried this. Like, next time you fly, you get on the airplane and someone smashes you with their bag, and all the things that happen in airports. Just try being like Mr. Gracious. And it's amazing how it changes the equation. And so that's the simple answer. The second answer is, you have to remember, this is going to sound like Jeffersonianism, but you got to remember who you're working for. You're working for the average people of your state, the plumbers, the construction people, the truckers, the farm workers, the people who work in a packing plant. You're working for insurance adjusters and tellers in banks. That these people would rather keep all their money, but they know the social compact. They know that they have to give up some of it for fire prevention and for garbage services and for water and so on. Police, they know they have to contribute part of their hard-earned money for government, but they want you to be humble about it, and they want you to be really careful with their money. So civility, tolerance, good humor. Remember the people that are under listened to, that are out there, that are in your district, that are just quiet people. They don't really care a lot about the legislative process, but they care about their money and they care about good government.
Are you doing right by those people, right? That's a pretty good thing. If you go to bed at night and say, did I do right by those folks? You've probably done your job that day. Hey, was Jefferson a man of good humor?
Yes, he was not funny. I've been studying him for almost 40 years, so I've collected all of his jokes, and they're not many. But he was good humored. He's easily amused. He had a good temperament. He was a little bit on the aloof side. I don't think he could get away with it today. Up there on the mountain, and he was an aristocrat, and he was a philosopher, and he was, his house was neoclassical in design and everything. He had the best wines and the best books and the best musical instruments and the best scientific instruments. And there was a little bit of that in Jefferson, kind of the aristocrat as Democrat. But people who met him, first of all, they realized how brilliant he was. And second, they realized that he was in favor of democracy at a time when most people weren't. Democracy was like a swear word for most of the founding fathers. They thought maybe a republic. but only white males of a certain property base should even be counted in that republic. They didn't want universal suffrage of any sort. And Jefferson was like, well, the people are actually sovereign, whether we like it or not, and we better probably listen to them because God didn't choose who's an aristocrat. It's eeny, meeny, miny, mo. And one person is born with a silver spoon, as was Jefferson. Another person is born in a hovel or a wigwam. Why should the one person thrive in this world and the other person be ignored? Jefferson understood this, and I think this is really the key to it, is that it's not about democracy as a civics thing, it's about democracy of respect. And I'll tell you another person who had that respect was Theodore Roosevelt. His view was everyone's entitled to a square deal. So let's say, Tim, you and I, just before we take our legislators out to the Elkhorn Ranch here, you and I play poker one night. Roosevelt said, you may get a better hand than I did. Because if you're dealing cards, sometimes you get a great hand and sometimes you just don't. He said, people will accept that. That's life. It's not fair. Life doesn't deal equal possibilities to everybody. But if the dealer is slipping cards to his best friend, if he's cheating, if the system is rigged and it's not a square deal, it's not a fair shuffling of the cards, that's when people lose their respect for a system. So what we need is to make sure that our civil servants are sterling in character and have great integrity. That's not quite as important for legislators, but it's important for them too. And then the people will say, well, I may not be rich now, but at least the system isn't rigged against me.
Clay, what a great guy. Thank you for your time. I mean, I authentically, genuinely appreciate that and look forward to future conversations.
I love this, Tim. Thank you.
I've been talking with Clay Jenkinson, a presidential historian, author, documentary, filmmaker, and he hosts a weekly radio program called the Thomas Jefferson Hour, where he answers questions in character. And you can find out about that podcast at jeffersonhour.com.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. We encourage you to review and rate NCSL podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Pocket Casts, Stitcher, or Spotify. We also encourage you to check out our other podcasts, Our American States, and the special series, Building Democracy.